Hello, I'm Bob Harris. Welcome to Duraamen's educational series for industrial and decorative concrete flooring systems. This video series is the application of Param 5500 self-leveling concrete over plywood as the base. Now, in past videos, you've seen us putting the Param 5500 over a concrete base. There's a couple different considerations when going over a plywood base. Number one is the structural integrity of the plywood. What we're concerned about is deflection, and the industry standard is L/480. And if you're not familiar with that code, that building code, you can consult with Duraamen as far as what that actually means. But in essence, if you could envision taking a weight, like maybe it's 10 bags of sand or 10 bags of concrete mix, putting it in the middle of the floor, and we're trying to measure how much that plywood is deflecting. Once this material sets up, this is an actual rigid material, and if it's going over the plywood base that's deflecting, in other words, it's not structurally sound, you could get some reflective cracking. So what could you possibly do to remedy that concern is you could use a tongue and groove type material over the top of the existing plywood, or if this was an option, you could shore from underneath to minimize or reduce the chance of deflection. So that's first and foremost. As far as the seams in the plywood, you're going to come over the seams with the Param FP, which is a fast setting fiber reinforced feather edge cementitious type product. And so you're going to skim all of the seams. You always want to do that over the seams of plywood. If you're going with a cement-based product, you're going to always skim the seams with a cement-based patching compound and go from there. Once this has had sufficient cure time, we're going to come back with the Paramol priming system. It's a vinyl acetate based primer additive, and in past videos over concrete you've seen where we've diluted this product, 1 part water to 1 part primer. In the case of going over a plywood sub base, we're going to go with this material full strength. So the logic would be come in, make sure that you've got a structurally sound sub base. You're going to address all of the seams with our Param FP. Now it's time to, once that's dried, it's time to prime with the Paramol and full strength. And so we'll roll that down. And normally on an actual project, what we'll do is we'll let that sit a minimum of 6 to 8 hours or until the next day. While the crew is setting up their mixing station, getting the bags off of the trailer or out of the truck, it's not a bad idea to go ahead and spray 1 more coat of primer just before the installation, just to make sure that we're in fact sealing off that plywood so it's less of a chance to get any outgassing bubbles. A very important aspect on a successful application of the Param 5500 self-leveling cement is the use of Spiderlath. And if you're going over wood, this is a must, that you must use the Spiderlath as a supplemental reinforcing every application when going over a wood subbase. It's offered in 2 different grades, 4.4 and 8.4, and obviously the thicker version is going to be used for a self-leveling cement. Well, why would we use a thinner grade of Spiderlath? For example, we'll have contractors that want to use an epoxy over a plywood base, so that's where you would use or consider the use of the 4.4. And the logic would be staple this down and then go with your epoxy and followed by a sand broadcast. And then once you've done that, you could go into your next step, whether it's a Scrofino cement-based trial down grade or an epoxy or whatever your decorative application. But in our case, in this video, we're using the 8.4 Spiderlath with the Param 5500. Now, there's a couple of options with regard to coloring the Param 5500. There's a unique and interesting product that's called Color Fast. It's a dry pigment that can be mixed into the material as you're mixing the Param 5500. You know, in past videos, we've also shown some interesting techniques by broadcasting the Color Fast into the wet material. So the logic would be, if you're going for kind of a mottled, almost a variegated marbled look, you could mix this neat, meaning no color. As you're installing it, broadcast the dry Color Fast into the wet material and use a random trowel pattern, and you're going to get some veining and some interesting streaking, if you will. So we're about to demonstrate the mixing of the Param 5500. So once, just before we start our mixing station, we'll talk about the requirements for the mixing as far as the amount of water per the amount of powder that's in the bag. The material will sit overnight, and once that's fully cured, we'll come back, and as an option, another coloring system could be aqua color. So think of this as an after-the-fact stain. Perhaps you're just trying to shift the color from a light gray to a medium gray, or comes in a variety of different colors. Now you've got the option of creating a supplemental color with staining it after the material is already hard. Before you apply this, you'd want to lightly sand, which we'll demonstrate later on in this video. Clean the surface and then go ahead and apply the aqua color. Once that's down and has had sufficient cure time, we're going to pre-seal with our Purdue A03, which is our water-based acrylic. Generally we'll spray apply that followed by back rolling, and I kind of consider that as like our prime coat to seal off the surface of the Param 5500. And then you have a couple of options. Option number one, in an industrial application that's subject to a lot of foot traffic, perhaps maybe they're dragging stuff across the surface, you would want to go with the E32, which is a water-based epoxy, over the top of the cured A03, over the water-based acrylic. And then for ultimate or premium durability, once the water-based epoxy has had sufficient cure time, you're going to go over that with the Purdue U46, which is a polyurethane. By far, the polyurethane provides the most abrasion resistance in terms of scuffing and scratches. So oftentimes people will say, wow, to cut expense, do we have to use all three applications? And the answer is no. You could conceivably put the prime coat of the A03 water-based acrylic, followed by the top coat of the Purdue U46. But regardless, whether it's a residential setting or more of a light industrial commercial application, you always want to put the final top coat of the Purdue U46 for the best abrasion resistance out there. So we're going to get set up, and we'll talk about the mixing requirements of the Param 5500, and we'll show you how that's installed. Before we do that, we're going to put our prime coat down, and then we'll get busy with the mixing of the Param 5500. We're getting ready to install the Paramol primer. For the purpose of this video, this plywood base does not have a seam. To recap, if you have a plywood base, the first thing we would have done is put the Param FP with the feather patch down in all of the seams. That would have had sufficient cure time, and once that was dry, then we would come back and we would prime like we're about to show you. We're putting this down with a 3/8 nap roller. Obviously, it's a good idea to, if you are working on the actual project, we've talked about in past videos the importance of keeping the substrate clean. So I would never just take my boots and step right onto the surface. I would have slip-on booty covers to make sure that my first step onto the surface is in fact clean. And we're putting this down somewhere around 250 square feet per coat per gallon. You can see it rolls down really nice, and this is neat, meaning over the wood base, it's not thinned down. The only time we would thin it as a primer is if we were going over a concrete base. So over our wood base, we're going to go unthinned. This first coat will dry 6 to 8 hours roughly, or the next day, and then we'll come back with one tight coat prior to installing our Spiderlath, and then on our second tight coat, once that's dry, we'll apply our Spiderlath, and once that's effectively adhered to the substrate, we'll go back with the Param 5500 self-leveling cement. All right, we just rolled down our second coat of the Paramol primer. As a recap, we installed the first application. It's been about 6 or 7 hours ago. It was completely dry, so on an actual real-world application, 6 to 8 hours dry time or till the next day, and then come back and roll your second coat down just prior to installing the Spiderlath, which is what we just finished here. And then as soon as it's tack free, where it allows you to walk on it without sticking or pulling any material up, you're ready to go ahead and install the Spiderlath, the 8.4 gauge. On our Param 5500 self-leveling overlay cement, just to recap what we've done up until this point. Remember, we're going over a plywood substrate, so we used the FP in all of the seams. Once that dried, we came back and we used the Paramol primer, and that needs to dry a minimum of 5 to 6 hours, or next day we primed a second time with the Paramol primer. And now that it's dry, we're getting ready to install the Spiderlath. To recap, remember this is important, it's the 8.4 gauge, okay? 8.4, not the 4.4. And we're gonna generally staple it down about approximately every 6 inches. So just a word of advice, if you're doing a large open area, they make the staple guns where you can get them in an electric version. You really go fast, so you're not having to crank down, so you might want to consider that. But virtually every 6 inches. We're getting ready to install our Param 5500 self-leveling overlay cement. Prior to getting started, I'd like to talk to you just briefly about the tools, because once we mix the material, I won't be able to talk quite as much. So first off, we use what's referred to as a gauge rake, and you can see it has little cams on the side here, and depending on the cam that you're using, it regulates the depth. So in other words, this material will flow underneath here, but this will be riding on a concrete substrate. So this looks like it's 1/4 inch. So when you're putting Param 5500 over concrete, the minimum depth requirement is in fact 1/4 inch. The problem is, if I use this gauge rake over our Spiderlath, it could compromise the Spiderlath. So in other words, it could drag the Spiderlath and pull it up off of the substrate. So for that reason, we want to use more of a looped end right here. You can see it's rounded off. So when I drag it across here, it's not catching the Spiderlath like the other one potentially could. So it is important that you take that into consideration. Now, a word of caution, going over a plywood base like we're about to do that's been reinforced with our Spiderlath 8.4 gauge lath, it's always going to be a minimum of 3/8 and preferably slightly deeper than that, for a couple of reasons. If you get too thin with the material, you stand the chance for reflective cracking, especially if our sub-base has deflection like we talked about earlier in the video. And also, if it's 3/8 or less, you could potentially get ghosting from the Spiderlath. So keep in mind, minimum 3/8, but a little bit thicker is always going to be a little bit better when going over wood. In past Duraamen videos, we've demonstrated the Param 5500 installation with the intentions of polishing it. So what we did is we installed the Param 5500 and we gauge raked it, and then we use what's called a spike roller. And the spike roller is great for leveling. It's very fast, easy to use, but the problem with that is sometimes it leaves dimples in the surface. And the fact that it's going to get polished, it doesn't matter, because in essence we're cutting off those dimples, leveling the Param 5500 back down to a smooth surface. So if we don't want the dimples, we use what's referred to as a smoothing paddle. Now, I receive a lot of phone calls from installers kind of complaining about the technique of the smoothing paddle. And once you learn how the smoothing paddle should be used, it's actually a very effective tool for putting it down, leveling it. And once you gain your confidence in your technique, you can actually put it down free of ridges. The only thing that you would see like marks from is perhaps if you over-watered the mix, which we're going to get into in a minute in terms of the mix ratio. But I wanted to demonstrate the proper technique for using the smoothing paddle. So if I'm walking this way, now normally, if I have material here, I'm going to be in spike shoes. I'm only demonstrating. I would actually angle the smoothing paddle. I'll put it up on top here so you can see. So when I'm walking this way, it's on a slight tilt or a slight angle this way. And when I turn and I come back, and I come back in this direction, the smoothing paddle is going to be angled this way. And I'm going to go like this, slightly. So by angling that, what it does, it's naturally forcing more pressure on the inside here, thus feather edging the outside. If I do straight like this, it's a consistent pressure that you're very likely to see a line there and a line here. But by feather edging, putting more pressure over here, and I'm actually with the handle, I'm actually slightly tilting the handle. So this edge out here, the outer edge, is barely touching the surface, thus feather edging. So there's a definite technique to the proper smoothing paddle, and I just wanted to run that through you here before we get started. So like anything, it takes practice to gain your confidence level, but I've personally put down tens and thousands of square feet of self-leveling cements with smoothing paddles that looks very seamless or trowel-free. With that, we're going to get busy and start getting set up to mix our Param 5500. Let's talk about Param 5500 mixing considerations. First and foremost, we have our mixing vessel. So this type of a bucket, typically you can mix 2 bags of material into a bucket that's this size. On a larger job, they make larger buckets that has a cart or a wheel with drills attached to it. There's a variety of different manufacturers, so do your homework, and you can mix as many as 4 or 5 bags, wheel it out to your location, and then pour a beautiful ribbon. So it just depends on the size that you're mixing. With these plastic buckets or polypropylene buckets, believe it or not, they're still a little bit absorbent. So what I like to do is, prior to getting ready, I'll pre-wet the bucket just to kind of wet it out, dump all of the residual water back out of the bucket, and then we're ready to go. So the mix ratio on the Param 5500 is between 4.5 and 5 quarts of water. And so one might ask, why the range? You know, why is there a range of a half a quart? Well, because there's a lot of influences that affect the viscosity of the material, such as temperature. Not only the ambient temperature, the substrate temperature, but the temperature of the powder. I've had a couple examples where manufacturers shipped a pallet of material, put it outside in the sun. They went to mix the material and they had ridges, and it set up almost instantly because the material was so warm. And the water also plays an influence on the viscosity of the material. So what we like to suggest is always start on the lower side, establish your mix design, start with your 4.5 quarts of water, keep your withheld water, which is right over there next to Chris. So 4.5 quarts plus 4.5 quarts equals 9, or 5 quarts plus 5 quarts equals 10, which is the high side of it. So what we'll do is we kept out a quart intentionally, and that way we've got withheld water that if we need to get the right viscosity, we're able to do that. Just from experience, I can look at the mix and determine the viscosity. I'm looking at the vortex, and generally speaking, what you're looking for within the vortex is you'll see a little bubble, and you want that little bubble that's about a dime, the size of the diameter of a dime, the coin of 10 cents. If that bubble gets bigger, say to a 50% or a 50-cent piece, you've overwatered the mix. So once you've established the correct mix design, you maintain that batch to batch to batch throughout. Okay. So the mixing requirements are approximately 3 to 4 minutes once you've started. The mixing is really important. We like to keep a spatula or a margin trowel to make sure you're scraping the sides, because as you start cycling in bucket after bucket, you'll get some residual buildup of the material on the side of the bucket, and what you don't want to happen is when you dump a fresh batch, you've got unmixed material. So that's another consideration. I use the scenario or the example of the material being warm. It's not uncommon to use chilled water. So oftentimes what we'll do is we'll take either a 55-gallon drum or a garbage can, we'll fill it with water, and then we'll throw ice bags, leave the ice in the bags, and we'll chill the whole bucket of water. And what we'll do is we'll actually use a bucket that's been pre-cut. So once we've established our mix design, we just dump the bucket in the chilled water, put a board across the top of the 55-gallon drum or the garbage can, put that on top of that and let it spew out the side. It's already been cut to 4.5 quarts or 5 quarts. And then once it stops spewing out the side, tilt it so you don't lose water and dump it in there. Anything you can do to expedite the mixing process, as opposed to every single time weighing out 5 quarts of water. We would literally, on a job, we would have probably 10 5-gallon buckets that have already been pre-weighed out with the water requirements, so we're not wasting time sitting there measuring each batch, batch by batch. So it's just little tricks of the trade like that that's going to help you be a lot more expeditious during your installation process. We've talked about in most of the Duraamen videos the need for safe working practices, and certainly with all the new silica laws in the industry, you want to protect yourself. So we'll be wearing dust masks while mixing, because unfortunately when mixing products like this, you do have airborne particulate or dust that goes airborne. So we're going to try to control that since we're working inside. Other considerations with self-leveling materials like Param 5500, these materials don't like air movement. So a good example of that, perhaps you're doing some renovation or restoration in a grocery store, and inevitably they've got the bunker coolers that ventilates underneath, and you have air coming across the surface. I've seen scenarios where these materials will almost skin over, kind of like an elephant skin. So be really cautious about any air movement when putting these types of products down. So with that, we're going to go ahead and mix. Like I said, we're starting off with 4.5 quarts of water per bag, times 2 bags equals 9 quarts of water. We've got 1 quart of water that's been withheld in the event that we need to boost it a little bit. We've got our withheld water, and we'll mix it for our 3 to 4 minutes. I'll put my spike shoes on, and we'll talk to you about gauge raking and then ultimately smoothing. All right, we're about ready to get started mixing here. A couple of observations. The proper drill is very important. This is a helical style mixing paddle that you'll want to use, and you want to use a minimum 650 RPM drill, preferably variable speed, because what happens is if you use a drill that's only one speed and I start with the first bag and you squeeze that trigger, it'll sling things everywhere. So having the ability to control the RPM, meaning on, off until you get the appropriate amount of material so you're not splattering everybody around you. So with that, we're going to get busy, try to control the dust to the best of our ability. We've mixed our Param 5500 for 4 minutes. The mix ratio looks very nice. Always remember to work smarter, not harder. So never am I going to try to take 100 pounds of material and lift the bucket. So I'm just going to just simply let it do its own thing. And it'll want to flow, as you can see here. Just roughly get it into place. I'll scoot it back a little bit. Scoot it back. If you're doing a smaller job like this is okay to have 2 people carry it to its final destination, or you could get the carts, the 4-wheeled carts, and you can wheel it in place, and then 2 people could actually dump it from there. So I'm going to go ahead and use the gauge rake. Get it into place. I'll go sideways into the corners. So for the purpose of our video here, we're using foam as our barrier or our dam for the material. You could use weather stripping on an actual floor, or furring stripping as well to stop the material from flowing. You have to make sure everything is in fact adhering down to the substrate, because the last thing you want is a blowout when you're putting the material down. Now, the way that I hold the gauge rake, the tilt there versus flush versus this way can affect the thickness of the material. So for that reason, I'm trying to keep this perpendicular to the surface. All right, I'm going to dump some more material here. Now I'm going to step out, well, actually get it cleaned off here. When you're doing a larger installation, you need to take into consideration the configuration of your room. You always want to hit it from the narrowest point of attack. So for example, if you're doing a room that's 15 by 50 foot, you would never start going across the 50-foot wide one. Logic would tell you you're more likely going to get a cold joint. So you would do the narrowest point. Also, you have to be very strategic on the rooms that you're doing. So oftentimes, you may have to use a bulkhead or a form. On one project I did, it was 38 stories on a high-rise, and we had probably 25 different rooms. So there's no way you can expect to start and not have a cold joint. So for example, what we would do is we would bulkhead off all the bathrooms and the offices, pour those first. It would set for 1 hour, pull the bulkheads off, and pour the wet material up to that joint. Okay, I'm going to pull my wave of material down to the low side here. Like we talked about in past Duraamen videos, be concerned about your surrounding areas. You don't want to contaminate areas that are not receiving the overlayment, so be concerned about that. So I'm going to go ahead, pull from my high side down to my low side. Remember how I talked about the angle of the tool? Angled again. One last pass. It's a little hard to demonstrate on something so small the correct techniques. So for example, I'm going to pull this way, and then come back. Okay, and that's the installation of the Param 5500. We have it down at 3/8 of an inch. I'm always going back, looking at it, make sure I don't see anything out of the ordinary like outgassing bubbles. And from what I can see here, we look great.